All right, welcome to another episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. Very special guest with us today. We got Phil Jones. Phil is involved in science, electronics, IT, consulting, relationship therapy, woodworking, neurofeedback, and software design. What I'm having him on the show specifically to talk about today is his software, his neurofeedback and EEG collection software, Neurodesigner. Neurodesigner is a piece of computational neurological software that does not make decisions for you, the clinician, but rather helps you organize and highlight representative information to help you more confidently create treatment strategies for your clients. So I heard Phil's talk at the Neurofield Neuroscience Conference a few weeks ago and was really intrigued by some of the stuff that you guys presented. And I'm glad to have you on the show today, Phil.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. So
Yeah, great.
let's get started. And if you could just tell me a little about how you sort of got into the field of neurofeedback originally. What kind of piqued your interest?
Well, my background's always been relatively technical, and my wife was involved in um, expanding her private practice to include other clinicians. And so, what happened was somebody brought a two-channel opportunity to the table and wanted to show it off, and was wondering if we would be interested in pursuing it. Um, And so after looking at it, I thought maybe there's some things that I could do with it. And so that started the whole ball rolling.
Gotcha. And then as far as with your company Neurodesigner, what was sort of the motivation to get started behind that? Did you guys see a gap, that was kind of in the market that, wasn't being filled with what you wanted?
Well, it was never really market driven, it was need driven. So what Neurodesigner was designed to do was bring in and collate, I guess, if you will, or bring in dissimilar data and make a visual presentation that made sense. Okay, normally what would happen is with most applications is you get a lot of information, but it was difficult to pull it together and find a common thread so you could kind of see what was going on, a little more clearly. I mean, there's a lot of data that comes off of this, and there's a lot of ways of looking at it. So we're just trying to make a way that, or I was just trying to create some way that made sense quickly. So that was the start of it all. Neurodesigner is a I don't know, I should say it's not an offshoot, but it's a continuation of another product called LPR, which was mostly Loretta based.
Okay. Yeah, you're absolutely right about, I mean, just the vast access to the amount of data. I mean, you look through one of those, NeuroGuide reports, it's just pages, you could do limitless pages, it seems like, of that. So what specifically did you identify as being, some of the really key pieces of information from either an EEG or a QEEG that you wanted to make sure that was highlighted or presented um, in a specific manner with Neurodesigner?
Well, there isn't one specific thing. So here's the point: is that most therapists out there or clinicians are more subjective than objective. So the thought was is that, well, it's really important to be objective and then validate that objective um, concern with probably a subjective presentation. So really, that's the key: is being able to provide a really objective process, hypothesis validation process, um, that kind of gives you an idea of what may be occurring. So everything's important, but it all has to make sense. So, we start with surface information, we move that, and we say, okay, does this validate? Does it make sense? And then we move our way through different surface presentations. We have the normal linked gears, average reference, the Gaussian. And then we move that into Loretta and see if it still makes sense. If it still makes sense, then we can start developing protocols. So it's really that. So there isn't one thing. It's saying, okay, how do all these things work together? How do they validate what I'm thinking is going on? If they do validate, then I feel better about making the protocol. Okay, and then when I make the protocol, Does it still validate as I'm training? If not, then can I make a change? Or was this the right thing to do? Does that make
Right.
sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens, when there's deviations from, say, what you see from a Laplacian montage versus linked ears, you know,
Well, that's a
how
good
do,
question. Yeah. And the reason why that's a good question is a lot of people don't, or a lot of clinicians may not be aware of volume conduction issues. And so you have to be really careful when you're looking at this stuff. And this is one good way of, when you're looking at the surface information and saying, well, I'm seeing in this Laplacian, but I don't see it in linked ears or average reference. Well, there may be some other issues. And the first thing you have to go back and look as well, is it a good recording? And if it's a good recording, are there volume conduction issues? Are there lesions that I didn't know about? Is there areas that are moving the current differently through the tissues in other areas? Do I have one electrode that is mirroring a lot of other electrodes? So it, that's the first thing you have to look at. And so that's a great question. So that's kind of where you start. You're just validating your data is good, right?
mm-hmm,
So the first thing you have to do, because this is really a kind of a data science application, is you kind of have to say, is my data good? And that's the first start of the process. But again, we're looking at, here's my data, this is what I think is going on, and let me validate it. That's the first step, right? The validation in this step, is it actually good data? Does it make sense? And if it's good data, what presentation do I use? Do I look at surface? Do I look at Laplacian? Do I look at Loretta? And you can't look at Loretta unless it's good. And if Loretta is going to match Laplacian, because the first part of the Loretta transformation is a Laplacian transform. So you kind of have to, use those opportunities to say, well, is what I'm saying real? And so that's kind of the start of it all. And
right,
I know it sounds kind of complicated, but it's not. And it's just in a way for a clinician to say, do I feel good about what I'm seeing?
right. So maybe you could walk me through, say, you record a good EEG from a patient. What would happen next when do you plug the data through the Neurodesigner program?
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. So you go ahead and run whatever reports you want from whatever vendor software you're using, and they come out as text files of some sort of, or a common diluted file. Those plug into Neurodesigner. Neurodesigner is just a very large database. That the thought is that every recording you can generate a large amount of information. So you have surface information, you have Loretta information. Within those two, you have phase shift, so on and so forth, or I should say phase shift, phase lock. You have absolute phase, and so on and so forth. Those all go into a database for that recording. Okay, then they stay there. Okay, what that means is that you can look at every recording, um, or you can look at different recordings, as many as you like, with the same view, right? So you're comparing apples to apples. So the first step would be to gather the data, import it into the database, and once it's there, now you can start visualizing it. So you can look at a surface presentation, and then right next to it have a Loretta presentation, and seeing if there's some similarities, if what you're thinking makes sense, right? Seeing if the source localization is actually appropriate. If it is, then you can move forward, right? And
Right,
then the next step after that is saying, okay, this is all localized now in Loretta. So now I can say, okay, let me align it to Brodmann areas. Let me take those Brodmann areas and put those into groups that match symptoms or concerns, and seeing if that has a relationship to what I'm observing in this patient, right? Or
right.
not. And that gives you an idea of, okay, this is moving forward. This is good. This data makes sense. It kind of matches, the presentation or the subjective assessment by the I don't know. I guess I'll just use the word subject, and and if it does, then you can move forward and you feel good about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then once you've done that, and along the way you're designing along the way, which is the cool thing about Neurodesigner, is that you can design custom networks or custom protocols and track those things from that perspective. So if you have a list of very customized problem areas, you can track it from that customization, that ROI, I call it, regions of interest. And you can kind of watch what happens, so you know when to change, or you know when things are working or when they're not working. Or you can say, wow, this is really interesting. I wonder what's happening over in this other network, right? So if I'm working on this one large network, what's happening in this smaller network? Is there compensatory things going on that I should pay attention to or not? And you can see all that really fast. So what happens in Neurodesigner, you can kind of look at a lot of information really fast, really quickly. You can look at multiple recordings or the same recording from different views. So that's the idea. I mean,
Right. So kind of taking a huge amount of data and then kind of filtering out what's important, what's not, and then giving that to people, to clinicians in a way that's actually going to be practical and help uh
yeah, but the
their
clinician gets
practice.
to choose. Yeah, and the clinician gets to choose what's important to them, right? But they get a step-by-step validation along the way that what they're looking at makes sense. But they get to choose of what they're looking at, what is important to them. So let's just say I'm only interested in attention concerns. So let me choose an attention network or an executive function network, and I'll just look at that for right now. But I want to see how that relates to other networks as well. So Neurodesigner has that built into it, where you can relate one network to another network and see the differences. Or you can look at one network and you can develop all kinds of descriptive statistics, and then do that with a different network and see how they align up. So now you have something that you don't normally have. You have a look at variance between areas of the brain, which is really important, I think. And we're probably going to see a lot more of that shortly.
Gotcha. And I was curious, tell me what's your take on, raw scores or raw data versus the Z-scores, as far as looking at actual, amplitude values or, versus the Z-score normative databases. What do you feel like there's an issue as far as using with the application of Z-scores now? Do you feel like um, the other data, the raw data is kind of a better way to go about that?
Well, I think Z scores are fine, but the Z scores don't give you the entire picture. They're only going to give you the information that's relevant to the database they were generated from, which may or may not fit all circumstances. So I think Z scores sometimes are really nice just to kind of see generally what may or may not going on and see if they match. But the raw data is really the place to be. You really want to be. Yeah, from my perspective, and only mine, I'm more interested in the individual and what's unique about that individual. And so looking at the raw data and developing um, a, how should I say this, a Z-score that's specific to that individual is kind of interesting, and using variance properties to do that, and then using that to move forward. So Z-scores are interesting, but Z-scores are, just a statistical tool. And so you can use them in different ways. You don't have to have a normative database sometimes, but it is a nice quick way to see what's going on, because a lot of times these normative database matches a large subset of the population you're dealing with. But you should drill down. You should move over to raw just to see what's going on. The problem with raw data is you don't have any baseline to say, what's out of, what I guess what's, you can't use standard deviations in raw data, but you can say what's higher, what's lower, or what's inhibited or what isn't inhibited. But if you kind of get an idea with Z-score, you can move into raw data and kind of set up a baseline that gives you more information. But there's things you can't see, like for example, I have a subject with synesthesia. You can see that pretty clearly in the raw data. You can't see in the Z-score. But I would hate to move forward without understanding that more clearly, right? Because it's
Right.
different. This person's brain is working just a little bit differently, and so I think it's important to understand. And I can see that if I look at the raw information.
Mm-hmm.
So, and
Right. So Z-scores might be kind of have a better application if you're looking at, I guess, at least when you're starting to look at someone's data, or if it's, maybe a relatively simple problem, compared to what you're talking about with a specific issue that may not at all show up, if you're looking at a Z-score database.
Yeah, I think Z-scores are a great way to get started, but I think that you shouldn't be afraid of the raw data. I think you should be really familiar with the raw data. There's a lot of stuff that you need to know to make sure that even the Z-score is valid. We went back, we were talking about volume conduction issues. You can't see that with Z-score, but you can see it in the raw data. And then you can say, well, if I can see it and it's there, are the Z-scores relevant? If they are, cool. That's just a really fast way of moving forward. But, but the red data is always the best thing to look at.
Right. So switching gears a little bit, I want to hear kind of your story as far as why, the development of your guys's EEG cap. I know it has some very unique features to it. And I was curious just what sort of got you to want to make that. And can you tell me a little as far as what the cap enables you to do, or just how it differs from your standard EEG cap?
Well, the cap started out because I needed a better source localization opportunity. I was doing all the Loretta and decided to do my own Loretta math, and came up with some issues and realized that 19 channels wasn't going to cut it. So I needed more. And so I wanted to develop 64 channels because that was the next standard. And there's a lot of room in between. Um, so, um, so I said, well, let me start with 19 and let me change a few things. So so with 19 channels, I thought, well, if I increase the electrode size and change the material a little bit, so I got a little bit better conduction issues. This is all this math's going to work better. That's kind of where it started. So that's what I did, and it worked really well. I was surprised. Then I wanted to be able to in this field, everything that you do to the brain works, and so it's just the idea of being able to measure it, right? And the nice thing about the neurodesigner is that it's just looking at the information. It doesn't care whether you need neurofeedback or stimulation or photomodulation or whatever. I don't care. The point is that it's just going to say, well, this is what's going on. And so that was the important thing with the cap, is I needed to be able to do other stimulations at the same time and see what was going on either in real time or near real time. So I wanted something that was kind of non-invasive and out of the way. And then, so that's cool. So I did that. But along the way you go, well, I'd like to solve some problems I have with other products. So the thing is I had with some other caps is that parts of them will rust. Well, when they start rusting internally, there's some issues that come up. And so I designed something that didn't have anything. There's no parts that can rust. So the electrodes are a little different. There's nothing in the rust. The wire, I changed the wire because I want to have a better, I thought, well, I want this a little bit softer so it's more comfortable. And I want it to conduct better. And I want more strands in there because I don't like breaking. I don't like when the wires break in the cap. They break too often. So I went to a very unique product. So I made this wire is a special, unique wire. And then, so I kept going and going and going. And then got to the point with the cap saying, look, all I really want to do is produce a very affordable cap, not the best cap in the world, but a really good cap for the money that resolves a lot of general concerns like, wire breakage, rusting, getting rid of the fabric so the cap dries instantly, changing the large connector at the amplifier so that if you pull on it, it doesn't hurt anything, so that there's the cap is just a little more durable. So that's kind of where it all started. And then I wanted to be able to move things around so the electrodes can be adjusted slightly, because as head size changes, and people's heads are a little bit different. There's an issue with electrode placement. If they aren't exactly the same, then some of the math is a little bit off. And so I was just trying to make something that that could actually be adjusted slightly, so that some of these things that we take for granted, like the location of the electrodes there's some consistency, so the math works a little better, so your source localization is more accurate.
Right.
It probably doesn't make a big difference, but I'm kind of picky. And so I thought, well, whatever I learn, if I can offer that to the clinicians out there, I think it might be interesting. And just trying to contribute to the community a little bit.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
you know,
You mentioned something as far as, not specifically caring, whether a clinician, is doing neurofeedback or neurostimulation or photobiomodulation. But, as you were talking, it got me thinking, is that something that, neurodesigner with, with the what it's showing you, with how it's giving you the data, is that something that you think, a clinician could use to, run someone on a specific protocol and then, look at how the brain changes through your guys's program and see kind of what specifically, a protocol may be doing for an individual?
well, yeah, that's the whole point. So it doesn't matter what you do; it's going to work. So there's going to be some kind of state change in the brain. So all these things are wonderful tools, and some are better than others. I mean, one of my clinicians, he uses probably 5 or 6 different things depending on what's going on. The thing is that he can measure the results of whatever it's using to see if he's going in the right direction. So, for example, he does a cue, gets an idea of what's going on, and says, what I really like to do is start out generally and maybe just reduce theta for this person. Um, or actually, reduce theta, maybe reduce a little bit of beta. I think that'd be a good place to go with this individual. So they might use a stimulation, or they might use 2-channel neurofeedback for a while just to reduce that. But they're checking every 3 or 4 sessions by doing a full cue and then using it in my software to compare the first and the last to see what changes occur and where they occurred. Okay. And then depending on where they occurred and what's happening, he says, okay, this is the next thing I'm going to do. Right. So, looking for, so you can see, well, things are changing. They're moving in the right direction. How stable are they? Right. All right. And then when are we done, or when do we need to move to some different modality? But that's the idea. So it doesn't matter what you do. You just need to track the results. You have to be objective about it. And that's the idea of neurodesigner. It doesn't care what you do. It doesn't matter, but let's track the results.
Right. Gotcha. So, do you have any specific stories or testimonials as far as, how neurodesigner has specifically affected any, patient outcomes? Have people been giving you any feedback on it?
Well, I don't get a lot of feedback, but the feedback I get is that if they have to move it to a different machine or something, and they're out in there without it for just a short period of time, they get panicky. So I'm guessing it has some value. A lot of the testimonies I've got is as far as being able to, what I've heard is being able to do things a little bit quicker, um, being able to be more focused, um, and being able to track the results more clearly. So, I don't know. I guess I should pay more attention to what everybody's telling me. What I pay attention to is if something doesn't work or they like something different, then that's really important to me. So, I'm trying to I'm trying to lower the barrier to entry to doing good neurofeedback so anybody can do it easily and quickly and have good results. So it's really important to hear what's going on and what other people would like to see. Um, but so, I mean, I don't really have a lot of anecdotal
Sure.
information. A lot of people have said great things. Unfortunately, I'm the kind of guy that listens to what didn't work rather than do what did work. So.
Right, right, right. Well, speaking of what you were talking about as far as kind of making neurofeedback, more um, giving more people access to it. Where I was going to ask you kind of where you see, this field of neurofeedback and neuromodulation and brain mapping, all of this stuff, where do you see it going? Are there any, new developments on the horizon that you're really excited about?
Well, there's a lot of new developments on my horizon, but I'm not going to talk about
Sure.
them. Not quite yet. So there's a lot of cool things that I'm doing. And there's only so many hours in a day, and I'm already working 7 days a week trying to get this thing working, or all these new features. But so there's a lot of stuff coming out. I've got I don't want to minimize anybody else's stuff, but I think it's important to experiment. And so I'm trying to produce very inexpensive software and hardware to be able to allow that um, introduction and experimentation to occur. So, I've got 64 channel amplifiers that are just cheap as all get out, but I haven't released them yet. The cap you see is starting to go in that direction. The software is coming along behind it. Um, but again, I'm only a one-man shop, so it takes a little time to get this stuff out there. But what I'm finding is that it's important to understand that this is a nice opportunity for to be very objective. So you're seeing the data from an objective perspective. You're saying, does it make sense? So that hypotheses validation methodologies is really the key, and this is what I'm doing to promote it. Being, having the database driven application is great. The application is changing. I can tell you a little bit. So it's getting away from depending, because I've talked about my own amplifiers, depending on anybody else's data. So you'd be able just to dump a common file into it and get all the nice metrics out with the one button, rather than having to load a lot of different reports. So we're trying to streamline it, make it faster. So I think that'll be kind of a nice feature for everyone. Plus, again, I don't know of anybody that's doing more than in a common application that's easily accessible, doing more than doing 64 channels or 73 channels, and being able to understand what's going on there, and using that higher resolution to their benefit.
Right, right. Awesome. Well, Phil, if anyone wanted to get in contact with you or learn more about Neurodesigner, where would you direct them to go?
Just neurodesigner.com. And if you want to get a hold of me, there's a contact form on the website. And
Great.
simple as that.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, Phil, I enjoyed having you on the show today. I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you.
All right.